Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to thank Carolyn Schwartz and the staff at the Eli Library for hosting my lecture this afternoon. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here today. Today, I'm going to talk about my most recent book, Lone Wolf Terror and the Rise of Leaderless Resistance. The face of terrorism is undergoing significant change today. There's a notable trend indicating the prevalence of lone wolf attacks by individuals in small cells with little or no connections to larger groups. And so over the past several years, several lone wolf incidents have gained headlines. For instance, in 2009, an anti-abortion activist by the name of Scott Roeder, he murdered a physician who performed late-term abortions. In June of that same year, a lone gunman, a little-known but long-standing right-wing extremist by the name of James von Braun, opened fire at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and that attack killed one guard. Then in November, Major Nidal Hassan, a Muslim-American psychiatrist in the U.S. Army, went on a shooting rampage at Fort Hood in Texas, and that attack killed 12 persons and left 31 wounded. More incidents followed in 2010. In February, a tax protester by the name of Joseph Stack, he slammed his private plane into a building in Austin, Texas, which contained offices of the Internal Revenue Service. Lone wolf terrorism is not confined to the United States. For instance, in July of 2011, Anders Behring Breivik carried out a bombing and subsequent shooting spree in Norway. More recently, in August of last year, a neo-Nazi skinhead by the name of Wade Michael Page fatally shot 6 persons at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. So the frequency of these lone wolf attacks indicate a shift in the nature of terrorism from organized groups to unaffiliated individuals. So today I'm going to talk about this lone wolf or leaderless resistance trend. But what is leaderless resistance? Well, in essence, leaderless resistance involves a kind of lone wolf operation in which an individual or very small group engages in terrorism independently of any official movement, leader, or support network. And to be effective as a strategic approach, leaderless resistance assumes that multiple persons and groups share a common ideology and they are willing to act on these shared views in a violent manner. Let me give you a brief outline of my presentation. First, I'll explain some of the factors that I believe give rise to this lone wolf trend. Several technological and political factors are leading to a kind of miniaturization of terrorist and insurgent groups around the world today. So I'll talk about geopolitical factors, specifically this notion of a new world order, sometimes referred to as the unipolar era, in which one superpower predominates. This has really drastically changed the security environment within which terrorists operate. After that, I'll talk about new technology and how it can be effectively utilized by small terrorist groups and lone wolves. Then I'll look at some case studies, including the American extreme right, the radical environmentalist movement, the anti-globalization movement, and radical Islam. Next, I'll talk about the implications of this leaderless resistance trend and weapons of mass destruction. After that, I'll discuss the characteristics of the new face of terrorism and why it's moving in the direction of leaderless resistance. Then I'll talk about some recent examples. First, I'll discuss the case of Anders Behring Breivik in Norway, and after that, I'll talk a little bit about Chris Dorner. And finally, I'll recap my main points in the conclusion. Okay, so first, let's look at geopolitics. The collapse of the Soviet Union drastically changed the security environment within which terrorists operate. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and several communist bloc states were covert supporters of terrorism. And initially, after the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, terrorism went into steep decline, in large part because several leading terrorist groups lost material support from communist states. So this development works against the viability of large terrorist organizations. They are more vulnerable to disruption because governments increasingly are coordinating their counterterrorism efforts with the United States. And for obvious reasons, this trend accelerated after 9/11. As to be expected in the aftermath of 9/11, the federal government, with support from the American public, implemented more vigilant measures to root out terrorists at home and abroad. For instance, the USA Patriot Act was signed into law in October of 2001. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security was created. Furthermore, after 9/11, there has been greater intelligence sharing, not only between federal agencies, but also with state and local law enforcement agencies as well. And despite differences over Iraq, after 9/11, foreign governments increased their coordination of their counterterrorism efforts with the United States. Moreover, new technology has enhanced the government's ability to monitor potential terrorists and their supporters. So as a consequence, large terrorist groups are increasingly vulnerable to disruption. But that said, small groups and lone wolves are still able to mount terrorist operations. So some aspects of new technology actually favor the terrorist. The internet is at the center of an ongoing revolution in communications and networking. The medium enables new forms of organization and greater dissemination of information. Dark side of the internet, though, is that it can be used by terrorist and extremist movements to disseminate their propaganda. Terrorist groups and their sympathizers, they can communicate with one another, raise money, and plan and coordinate operations. So the internet enables geographically dispersed people to collaborate on projects, including insurgency and terrorism. So through the internet, like-minded people can find information about a particular ideology. And what's crucial in holding these decentralized circles together, these networks together, is a shared ideology. A shared narrative and doctrine enables these networks to maintain their sense of cohesion and purpose. Furthermore, the rise of the so-called new media has really led to a diffusion of soft power around the world today. The democratization of the media has empowered many people who previously would not have had much voice in the marketplace of ideas. For instance, on websites such as YouTube, people can bypass the mainstream media and post videos that are made directly to the public. And terrorist groups can take advantage of these platforms by posting videos that exhort their fellow travelers to commit violent acts on their own initiative. So the internet facilitates leaderless resistance in a number of ways. For one thing, the internet enables covert communications and great anonymity. The cost of the internet is low, and that allows for great access to the medium. The internet enables dissident groups to circumvent restrictions on speech, such as censorship. And the internet can also serve as a recruiting mechanism. And it's worth mentioning that some groups avoid membership altogether. Through websites, a person can become a true believer of an ideology without any formal connection to the organization. Furthermore, websites can serve to instigate terrorism without any specific connection to the perpetrators. For example, in the late 1990s, there was a website called the Nuremberg Files. It was operated by an anti-abortion activist in Oregon, and the site listed the names and addresses of physicians who performed abortions. And the site contained these unsubtle suggestions that there should be some kind of retribution against them. And so when a doctor was killed, his name was crossed out on the list. So various trends in technology and networking are contributing to the miniaturization of terrorist and insurgent groups around the world today. I'll now go into some of the case studies. First, the American extreme right. At the present time, the American extreme right is a small movement, does not really have broad-based support, and the extreme right faces repression from both the government and private monitoring organizations, such as the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. So as a consequence, the extreme right cannot really conduct any kind of sustained, organized terrorist campaign. I have a picture on the screen there of the raid against the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, back in 1990.